Hi there, and welcome to the Skylight Books author reading series. If you'd like to learn more about us and our many upcoming author events, please visit skylightbooks.com, where you can browse our inventory, buy books, and join our Friends with Benefits Club. You can also follow us on Twitter, Tumblr, and Facebook. To speak to a real live bookseller like me, please call 323-660-1175. Thanks for your support, and enjoy.
Okay, so now on to Memories of Survival. Memories of Survival depicts Esther Nisenthal Krinitz's, and I hope I said that right, Nisenthal, yeah? Krinitz's remarkable journey of living through the Holocaust in Poland. At 15, she defied Nazi orders and separated from her family as they and other Jews from their Polish village reported to a nearby train station. Making their way, that is, her and her sister, a 13-year-old sister, made their way to a village where they were unknown. Esther and her younger sister survived the war by posing as Polish farmgirls, which is very similar to the end. Have you ever read Wartime Lies by Louis Begley?
No, I know of the book, but
there's a very similar, at the end, they pose as farmers. Anyway, but that was fiction. They never saw their family again. At the end of the war, Esther and her sister traveled to a displaced persons camp in Germany, where she met and married Max Krinitz. In 1949, with their baby daughter Bernice, they immigrated to the United States, living first in Brooklyn, New York, and later in Frederick, Maryland. Yeah. Unlike many Holocaust survivors, Esther always shared with her daughters her memories of life during the war. But when she turned 50, or when she was 50, she decided she wanted them to see her home and family. Esther went on to create a series of 36 exquisitely detailed works of fabric collage and embroidery. At once naive and infinitely complex, now I didn't write the naive part, these images reveal both the extreme horrors of war and the cherished family memories they shared before the war began. Told in Esther's own words, with commentary written by her daughter, Bernice Steinhardt, Memories of Survival is an unforgettable look back at a time that must never be forgotten. Bernice Steinhardt is the president of Art and Remembrance, a nonprofit arts and educational organization. In founding Art and Remembrance, Bernice and her sister, Helene McQuaid, were inspired by their mother's stories and artwork. Recognizing the power of their mother's art, they created Art and Remembrance as a testament to their mother's legacy and a means to share her work with those of others who depicted their experiences as victims of war, oppression, and injustice. Since its founding in 2003, the organization has created a traveling exhibit of Esther Krinitz's art, which has traveled to close to 24 museums in the U.S., produced an award-winning film, Through the Eye of the Needle, and published the book, Memories of Survival. I'm very excited, personally, to be hosting this event. Please join me in welcoming Bernice Steinhardt.
thank you. We've lost the...
Oh, we've lost it again?
Yeah. I moved the laptop. Shortly after I got here, I got an email from a couple of the staff here who wanted to order some books for the store. And so I wrote back to say that I was actually here. And if they were interested, I'd love to do a book event. So that's why I'm here. And it turned out, actually, that the people I heard from, a couple of the staff here, had been to see the original artwork, my mother's original artwork, which is on display in Baltimore at the American Visionary Art Museum. And I guess they were very... Oh, can you hear me? Or should I just use this? Let me step back here. Yes, so they had seen the artwork. They loved it. It's incredibly beautiful and moving experience. So they were happy to discover that I was here. I was happy to come. So serendipitous all around. Anyway, it is really a great honor, actually, for me to be here and to share something of my mother's art and story with you. You've kind of gotten the background of it. Sally, do you want to, is he okay? Or do you want to stay with me? Okay, you're good. This is Solly. Here. Okay. Solly, you're going to stay with me while I tell the story of Great Grandma Esther? Okay. Okay. I feel this is actually kind of appropriate to have, and wonderful to have my grandkids, a couple of my grandkids here, because what my mother did, she did for her family. She did it to remember the family that she had lost, and she did it really for me and my sister. She never intended that her work would be displayed in public. She just wanted my sister and me to see what her home and her family looked like. So she started with a couple of pictures. This is the very first picture that she did, and its scale is really, you can't really see how big it is. Are you coming back to me, Sally? Okay. Okay. This picture is actually about 4 feet by 4 feet. And this was the first one that she made. She just took a piece of fabric. She had never been trained as an artist. She didn't know how to draw. And so she was somewhat reluctant at first to do it all on her own. She wanted my sister to draw a picture of her house. But my sister said, "Mom, I don't know what your house looked like. You have to do this yourself." So she got a piece of cheap fabric because she could sew anything. She had been trained as a dressmaker when she was 8 years old. She was apprenticed to the village dressmaker. So she just got this large piece of fabric and drew out her house and some of the other features, her neighbor's house, and then just filled it all in with stitches. And then when she was finished with this piece, she gave it to me. And then she made a companion piece for my mother. This is the view for my sister. This is the view from across the road from her house. You can see the road there with the farmers coming in from the fields. In this picture, my mother pictures herself coming up the hill, and she's bearing a couple of buckets of water from the river. And at the house, her mother is there, her father, her older brother, her sister Manya, the one she survived with, is waiting at the top of the hill. Her dog, the horse. This is the home that she wanted us to know about. The companion piece, which she made for my sister, because she was very even-handed. She had to make one for me. I'm the older one, but she had to make one for my sister. And here she and her brother are swimming in the river, and their sisters are on the banks with the animals, the ducks and chickens and geese. And it is the most beautiful pastoral scenes. These were extremely happy memories. So she did these two, and then she kind of set these memory pictures aside. And then she went back to them, about 10 years later. She returned to these memory pictures. And her style changed. She started doing fabric collage because it was too time-consuming to do the crewel embroidery that she had done in the first two pictures. And by this point, she also knew that she was going to be telling her story. And she started adding these stitched captions. So she was actively telling her story, not just taking snapshots, but really creating almost a filmic presentation. Bram asked if he could come up. You're welcome to come here if you want. No, okay. So here she is in this particular picture, and she did a few pictures of her life before the war, and most of the pictures she did were the story of her survival, and then a few of her life after the war. And this is one from before the war of a holiday called Shavuos, which is usually in June. And she and her brother and sisters were on their way to their grandparents' house. And her brother had made her a pair of stilts. She used to call him the toy maker, and she was the toy tester. She was something of a tomboy, so she would try out all of his creations. And here she was in the caption, she describes how proud she was to be able to make it all the way to their grandparents' house without falling. And you'll see all of the pictures, to me, are incredibly beautiful, but this is one of the most beautiful. It has so much color and life to it. All of the pictures have frames, fabric frames around them, and she used color as a way of setting the period of time, so that all the pictures from before the war, all the pictures during the war have black fabric frames around them, and the ones before and after the war have either blue or green. There's one that's white, because she wanted clearly to distinguish the happy part of her life from the terrifying part of her life. And this is the only one, though, where she was so exuberant that she kept stitching these sheaves of wheat into the border of the picture, not just in the fields as they're going through them. She just loved this motif. And actually, we used a motif very similar to this on the gravestone for her and my father. I think it would have resonated with her. This is now, so those pictures were in the late 1930s. In 1939, the war arrived. The war arrived in September, right at the outset of the war. The war came to her village. And my mother had heard that there was a few soldiers that were coming into the village. And so she and her friends ran down to her grandparents' house, the same grandparents that they were going to see on Shavuos. And they stood there and watched as these soldiers rode up to her grandparents' house, which was at the entrance to the village. They rode up to her grandparents' house and pulled him off the steps of his house, and she watched as they cut off his beard, because the beard was the sign of a Jew. Only Jewish men wore beards. So they knew immediately that this was a Jewish family, and they cut off his beard. And this was the way the war began for my mother. So the Germans occupied her village for 3 years, from 1939 to 1942. And during this time, life grew progressively more difficult for the Jews. My mother could see that what was happening around her. They were no longer able to earn a livelihood. Her father was a horse trader. He used to travel around the countryside buying and selling horses, and her mother raised ducks and chickens and geese and would sell them at markets. So all that came to a stop. And my mother and her sister, everybody had to figure out how to help the family. And my my mother and her sister helped the family by working for other farmers. So they became farmhands. And here my mother, and at this point, this was in 1941, the Jews were no longer allowed to own any farm animals themselves. So here she and her sister were tending cows that belonged to other farmers. And it was a beautiful day in June. And my mother decided that they could take their cows to the good pasture near the Vistula River, this big river that was near their village. And when they got there to this area, to this pasture, they could see through the trees and bushes that they were next to this camp, this slave labor camp called Yanishev. Before the war, this had been actually a prison camp. They used to bring prisoners there to rebuild this earthen dam that used to get washed out in the spring floods, and they would bring them there afterwards to rebuild the dam. But now they were using the slave labor, just Jews, young boys and Jewish men, and my mother could see them through the trees. And here she watches as one of the soldiers leads a boy who had become too exhausted to work anymore, and he's led into the forest and shot. So when my mother was making these pictures, they lived about an hour, less than an hour away from us, and my son Simon, the father of Bram and Solly, and our daughter and my husband, we would go to my parents' house every Sunday for dinner. And so I always saw what my mother was working on, because she always had something that she was working on. And she would show me where she was, and it was always amazing to me. But when she showed me this picture, I was literally awestruck. To me, this image captures the essence of war through the eyes of a child. On the one side of the picture is this beautiful scene of great beauty and of life, the grass. And if you see this, I guess in the book you can see every single blade of grass is a separate stitch. So these fruit-bearing trees and the flowers, so vividly green grass. And on the other side of these trees is this scene of great brutality and terror. And they're only separated by this thin line of bushes and trees. And so just her composition, the fact that she could capture the essence of war in such a direct and straightforward way was just, as I said, awesome to me. When I showed this picture, I've done a number of classroom presentations, and I showed this picture to a group of fourth graders. And I asked them what they thought of this picture. And one boy said that this picture showed him that there was a thin line between good and evil. Incredibly insightful and true. So this is now October 15th, 1942, all the Jews were ordered to leave their homes and report to a nearby train station in another city. And my mother refused to go. No one knew exactly what was going to happen to them, where they were being taken to. They just had to report to the train station. But having lived under 3 years of German occupation, my mother knew that whatever it was not going to be good. And so she had this idea that she wanted to take Manya with her. She didn't want to go by herself. that she and Manya could go to work for Polish farmers, just as they had been doing. So they could go to some other village where no one knew that, or away from their home village, and find work there. And she begged her father to think of someone that, a friend of his that she could go to, a Polish man, who would take them in and give them work. And so he finally came up with the name of a friend of his, Stefan. So once my mother had this name, she was determined they were going to go to Stefan's house. So here they're saying goodbye to their family. This is the last time that they saw them. And everybody, my mother describes this scene, everybody was crying. In the book, well, just an observation here. My mother did not create these pictures in the chronological order in which the story unfolded. She created them in what I call a psychological order, the pictures that she needed to depict first were the earliest pictures. And this was one of the very first pictures that she did. So you can see it's kind of two-dimensional. It's on just a single plane because she hadn't learned perspective yet. Over the roughly 10-year period that she was working on these pieces, she learned so much. It was really remarkable. I didn't include it in the slides, but in the book, you can see that the next picture, which was the chronological picture, this was one of the first pictures she did. The next picture in the sequence is also of leave taking, but it was done about 10 years later. And the difference in composition and color choices and so on is very striking. She had clearly evolved in her artistic technique quite a lot. But here they're saying goodbye to their family. They had their baskets packed for work with digging hoes, and they left. Their mother had paid a neighbor to take them to her, to the other village of Dąbrowa, where Stefan was, but she abandoned them, and she abandoned them. My mother grew suspicious that she was going to turn them into the Germans because there was a bounty. So they left, and they went to the road where all the Jews were on their way to the train station. And here they met up with their cousin Dina, who was walking with her baby. And Manya, her sister, Manya never wanted to go with my mother. She wanted to stay with the rest of the family. It was only because their mother told her, Manya, go with Esther, that she listened to her mother. And here, when she saw Dina, she just kind of latched onto her because it was someone that she knew and loved, and she thought she would be reunited with her family. But when my mother realized that they were getting close to Krasnik, the train station, she started to pull Manya off the road to go on their own to Dąbrowa. And Manya didn't want to go. She wanted to stay with Dina. And it wasn't until Dina told her, go with Esther, that she listened. So I have always said that Manya survived because she listened, and my mother survived because she didn't. Two very different personalities. Excuse me. Remember this picture because I'm going to come back to it. So here they arrived at Stefan's house. And this picture is remarkable because it takes place over several days. So here they arrive at his house. They tell him, "We're Hersch's daughters, please help us." He embraces them, tells them not to worry, he'll take care of them. He puts them up in his attic where they're stringing tobacco leaves. And after a couple of days, he calls them down and tells them that they have to leave. Everybody in Nishik, their home village, knows that they're with him. And if the Germans come, they'll kill the girls, they'll kill him, they'll burn down his farm. He can't keep them. So he sends them out into the rain along this path until they come to the woods, and they're drying their boots in the trees there. And there my mother realizes that they cannot survive as Hersch's daughters. And so she makes up these identities for them as these Polish Catholic girls from a town on the other side of the big river that she had heard her father talk about. So she made up these names, very Polish names, Josefina and Marysia Grochowiecka. They were from this town called Chizów. They had been separated from their family because the family's farm, the Germans had confiscated the family's farm and given it to these ethnic Germans, these so-called Volksdeutsch. And so they were separated from their family and they were looking for work. So they went from village to village with this story, but people wouldn't keep them for more than a day or two because they didn't have papers. People wanted to see papers, baptismal certificates. And then finally, they came to a village where people didn't ask them for papers. And there, they had been hiding in the woods, trying to figure out their next moves, and it was growing dark, and my mother said, "We can't stay here in the forest because if we're discovered, people will know we're Jewish. No one other than two Jewish girls would be hiding in the woods." So she said, "We have to just go to the next village called Grabówka and go straight to the sheriff's house and tell him our story." And Manya was terrified at the idea of going to the sheriff's house, but she said, if we're going to be taken for the Grochowieckas, we have to act like that. So they went to the sheriff's house. He told Manya, my aunt, that she could stay with work for his mother. And he said my mother could work for this older farmer whose wife was sick and bedridden, so he needed help. And that's what they did. And they stayed in this village under these assumed identities for the next 2 years. And this here is the man that she lived with. She called him Dziadek, which is the Polish word for grandfather. He was very fond of her. It was never clear, well, he took her for who she said she was. He might have suspected who she really was, but it was never spoken between them. He was very cautious and with her, and very mindful. And so on this day, these two German soldiers marched into this garden that my mother had planted. And so Dziadek positioned himself there to watch and see what would happen. And they were talking to my mother. They were trying to engage her, but she refused to engage with them because they were speaking to her in German. As being a Jewish girl, she understood German because it's very close to her first language, Yiddish, but she had to pretend that she couldn't understand them, so she just kept her head down. Now, the farmer kept bees. And you can see in the back, he had all these beehives. And while this was happening with the soldiers, suddenly the bees came out of their hives and started swarming around the soldiers until the soldiers finally left. They couldn't, and my mother said in the caption, the soldiers were asking, why aren't they stinging you? But my mother always regarded this day as the day that the bees saved her. She didn't regard it as a magical thing. She thought that there was something about maybe the soldiers were wearing some kind of cologne or something in their scent. Bees don't like strangers. They knew, obviously, my mother and Jadek. But it was remarkable when she told me about this. It was just remarkable because no people could save her, but the bees could. The bees, so she always regarded this as the day the bees saved her. So this is now July 1944, when the Russians came through on their way west. And after this, they liberated the whole region. And a couple of months after this, my mother went back to Mniszek to see if anyone else had returned. But here they are greeting this small platoon of soldiers, of Russian soldiers, boys, my mother said, coming through on their way. So my mother went back to Mniszek to see if anyone had returned. No one had. And no one knew where they had been, what had become of them, where they had been taken. But one of her neighbors thought that perhaps they had been taken to this camp called, a concentration camp called Majdanek, which was not terribly far from where they lived. So my mother, who was then 17, went to Majdanek. And here she is at the bottom of the picture in this yellow dress with her braids. I always thought she looked like Dorothy on the road to Oz. And Majdanek is actually a very, very large camp. It's spread out over a wide area. But my mother compressed in this picture all the main features. So you can see the crematorium with a chimney, these gas chambers on the right. In the back is this field of giant cabbages that were growing on a bed of human ashes. And then in the front on the left is this building that was filled with shoes. And actually there are tens of thousands of pairs of shoes there that were left behind. And my mother started combing through the shoes to see if she could find her mother's shoes. It's just incredibly poignant scene. So the Russians had liberated the camp, and they gave my mother a tour of the camp. And after she saw the whole place, she enlisted in the Polish army, which was under Red Army command. And she went with them on their way to Berlin. Here she is, well, here they are along the road. And it was after this, they went to Germany. My mother went back to Poland to get Manya, and then the two of them went back to Germany to a displaced persons camp, a DP camp, which is where my mother met my father. My aunt met her husband. They all got married. Lots and lots of people got married in the camp because most of the survivors were young people who wanted to put their lives back together again. So there were a lot of weddings in this camp. And in fact, there are a few pictures, my parents' wedding picture and some other wedding pictures, and all the brides are wearing the same dress, which they wore when the photographer came to take pictures. It wasn't at the actual wedding. I always was so taken with this image of this one wedding dress that served all the weddings there. So my father, who had an entirely different story, he had relatives in New York. So they applied to emigrate to the United States. While they were waiting for the visa, my father went to Belgium to find work there, then sent for my mother, who was already pregnant with me. And I was born in Belgium. And then here we are arriving in New York. And that's me on my father's shoulder there. And we were met by my father's cousin, Clara, who my mother recalls when she was standing with us at the entrance to New York Harbor. She looked at me, I was sleeping, and she looked at me and she says, my mother put this in the caption, "My dear child, this will be your America." What a difference from today's immigration stories, by the way. Really, here, my parents and me, we were greeted, and my mother's memory was of this. In fact, I asked her what was her feelings when she saw the Statue of Liberty coming into the harbor, and she said that her first thought was that she would never have to feel she felt she would never have to hide her Jewish identity again, that she could be herself. So this is now in Brooklyn, which is where I grew up. And this is the backyard of the house where we were living at the time. And in that backyard, there was this old overgrown sour cherry tree. My mother was a fantastic cook, really world class. And she was also Eastern European. So when she saw these sour cherries, she had to climb this tree and pick the cherries because she saw blintzes and compotes and pies, all kinds of things. So in the picture, this is me and Helene, my sister, and you can barely make her out there in the blue dress in the trees. And she climbed up into the tree and she was passing buckets of cherries down to me and my sister at the foot of the tree. And she included, behind the fence, the neighbor boy. My sister and I were the envy of all the kids in the neighborhood because our mother could climb trees. And in the caption, my mother tells the story of how when she was a little girl, she used to sit with her grandmother, and her grandmother would say, "Esther, when you grow up, you're going to go to America. And in America, money grows on trees." And she would say, "But Grandma, I'm really good at climbing trees." So every time she would climb this tree, she would remember this conversation with her grandmother. So I just wanted to tell you a little bit about Art and Remembrance, the organization that my sister and I founded. My mother, as she was making all these pieces, she would just give them to me because I lived nearby. And I would hang them on my walls, and then eventually I ran out of wall space. But also it became clear that what she was creating really needed to be seen beyond the people who were coming to my house, that they really needed to be out in the world. So I worked for a few years in trying to get them out, and then my mother died in 1999, and a couple of years later, my sister and I started Art and Remembrance as a way to share her legacy with the world. But we also knew beyond just sharing the images that the education potential was enormous. That this was a way to tell the story of one girl during the Holocaust and what her life was like, and to share the experience of war in that way. But it was also a way to connect with contemporary social justice issues, not just what happened during the Holocaust, but what unfortunately has continued in the world ever since. So I would encourage you to take a look at our website. There are bookmarks up at the counter which you're welcome to help yourself to, that have our website on them, but it's just artandremembrance.org. And there you can see all of the images that my mother created. There were 36. I've just shared a smattering of them with you today. And of course the book has additional images, not 100% of them, but almost all of them. And also there are descriptions of some of the programs that we have and work done by other people as well. The last slide I want to show you, remember I said, remember this image. The picture on the left was one that appeared on the front page of the International New York Times. Bruce and I were in Poland showing the film. Oh, you can also see the film. I would encourage you to do that on our website. We were in Poland at the time that the Syrian refugee crisis kind of came to international attention. And when I saw this photograph, I was immediately reminded of this photograph, or of the picture that my mother did of this line of humanity fleeing, whether in one case fleeing to safety, in another fleeing to their deaths. But this is a story, as I said, this is a story that never, unfortunately, that never ends, is always with us, and that we always need to remember in order to do whatever we can to change this narrative. It's one that really needs to end. So I'm going to stop there. I'm happy to answer any questions, if any of you have any.
I mean, the artwork is really outstanding. How old was your mother when she was doing all the needlework?
So did everybody hear the question? Well, the question is, how old was my mother when she was doing this work? Which I think is a remarkable part of the story. My mother did the first two pictures when she was 50, and then she came back to them when she was about 60, and so she did most all of the pictures. All the rest of the pictures she did when she was in her 60s. And I was so impressed as she was doing this that she had found this wellspring of creativity. I mean, she was always a very incredibly handy person, but she had never done anything like this. And it came to her late in her life.
And did she draw them first somehow, or she just started?
Stitching. She drew, when she started doing the collage, she would draw elements of the picture, like figures or houses, but she really didn't do like an entire sketch. She just transferred pieces, and then she filled everything, all the background, or she actually laid it onto a background that she had already stitched down. So it was both planned out with drawing and also freeform. And she never used, I don't know if any of you stitch, but she never used an embroidery hoop or anything like that. She worked at the dining room table for the most part. Yes?
Did she teach you how to stitch or embroider?
You know, people ask me whether I inherited this talent. No. The answer is no. I mean, I did learn how to embroider, and there was a time in my life when I did do embroidery and knitting and crocheting, all those crafty things. But in answer to that question, I often say that my mother's talent was to create these pictures, and mine was to bring them out into the world. So we were a good team.
This is a comment, not a question. But first of all, thank you for continuing your mother's legacy by sharing her work.
Thank you.
This is the share in terms of us being here today because I actually my first wedding was actually your mother's artwork was the backdrop. It was at AVAM, American Visual Arts Museum,
Really?
Baltimore in
Wow.
2003.
Wow.
We happened to be here last night, and I saw that this looks like that artist. And so I walk up there, and my husband said, my second, the keeper.
That was your starter husband.
And he's like, she's here tomorrow night. And we had all these pictures taken, and we were wrapping it up. We have to go.
Wow. I'm going to tell. So Rebecca Hofberger, who is the director of the museum, loves this. I mean, this is the exhibit that's there now is the third or fourth time that they've had the collection, and it's a very personal thing with her. So I'm going to tell her that we met you here. I have to say just that our journey with my mother's work and our organization is filled with moments like that, these little pearls of serendipity, coincidence, connection. It's really been a remarkable. Yes.
How did your mother feel when other people outside the family saw her work? Did she get a chance to? I mean, I know that you started the organization a couple years after her death, but was she embarrassed? Did she enjoy it? Did she think of herself as an artist?
She never really thought of herself as an artist because she thought of herself as a documentarian. She was describing something that happened to her and her family. But she really was, I think, very flattered and appreciative of the interest that other people showed in her work. I think she was a little surprised that other people found it as she was not surprised. I guess she was gratified that my sister and I appreciated it as much as we did. But the fact that strangers who didn't know her or anything about her family, that they would be moved by it was also very meaningful to her. At the time that she got sick, we had sort of a public exhibit of her work at a synagogue in Washington, D.C. And she did what I'm doing now. I just ran the carousel, but she did the slide talk, and she spoke before an audience in the main sanctuary of a main synagogue. She spoke before 300 plus people there was absolute stillness. People were just mesmerized. She was a great storyteller. And she was this little, 5 foot tall woman. And she did a fantastic job. And then there was an exhibit of many of her pieces. People were so eager to see them. So it was wonderful that she had that opportunity, at least that opportunity, to see how her work was received by many, many strangers. Yeah.
I was wondering if her sister, your aunt, documented her
No, my aunt never did. My aunt's memory, well, my mother's memory was extraordinary. So it's not to be critical of my aunt. She just didn't have that extraordinary visual memory. My mother was the older one. She needed to be alert to what was going on in the environment, and she had an artistic sensibility. So but my aunt did what she needed to do. She was a hard worker, and she was a good, an essential companion to my mother, but it wasn't in her to do that.
Could she climb trees?
I don't know. She could ride horses. I don't know.
After all those years, what sort of got her to sit down and be creative? Like, what do you think, on an everyday level, what sort of pushed her to just sit down and do her stitching? What sorts of, like, I don't know, what kinds of moods was she in? Or, like, what do you think got her to just pour out her creativity?
I think that a lot of it had to do with her age, that she had just reached a time in her life when legacy became meaningful to her. And she wanted to pass on her memories, because her memories were all that she had, all that there was in the world of her family. And she wanted to her children to know her family. She had always told us those stories, but she wanted to document. She wanted a record of it. Years earlier, she had started to write a kind of record of her story, but that wasn't her media. She wasn't a writer. She wrote a lot, but because she was a storyteller. But this was her way of telling her story. And when she started this, then she worked on this until she couldn't work on it anymore. And she wasn't finished. She would have done more pieces if she had had the time, the lifetime. Manya lives in Dallas. She's still living. She just turned 90 last year. And she moved there from New York. She and my uncle moved there from New York to be near her kids who had moved there. So she's doing fine. We saw her last summer. Oh.
Thank you.
You've been listening to the Skylight Books author reading series. Don't forget, you can listen to this and all of our other great podcasts at skylightbooks.com. Thanks again for stopping by, and we hope to see you soon.